Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Topical Hour. God of War Ragnarok was my most hyped game of all time back in 2022, and as it's almost been a year since it came out, I wanted to do a bit of a retrospective. The last time I spoke of Ragnarok, I gave it a 10 out of 10, I said it was better than God of War 2018, and that it was the best game I have reviewed. All three of those things are blatantly wrong. I reviewed the game about a day after I beat it and like 2 weeks after the release. Obviously there was a bit of recency bias, but more so I think I just kinda ignored the problems. And there are a lot of problems. So we'll start with the story. The biggest difference between the story of this game and last game is that in the last game we were constantly working towards a goal and we always knew exactly how to get there. It was just a matter of getting there. In this game the characters flounder really hard. Like, we're avoiding Ragnarok, but we're also constantly fulfilling prophecies that bring Ragnarok about, and motivations are constantly confused. And none of this is helped by the one-shot camera that we're so desperately holding on to. I mean, after we get to Sindri's house, we just make up stuff to keep the story going and hit the marks we need to hit. For example, everyone was wondering after the last game how Jormungandr would fit into all this. Well, he really doesn't. The only purpose Jormungandr serves in this game is teaching Loki more about how marbles work. He doesn't even really help him to Ironwood. Another example, we expect to see Surtur and get more story with him, but we pretty much get like an hour dedicated to him, and he barely even ends up mattering anyway. It just feels like we have to keep putting Kratos and Atreus in situations to resolve questions from the last game, even though the answers aren't very satisfying to game anyway. And honestly, that's the tip of the iceberg of the issues in this game. To go on, the writing in this game is significantly worse. A lot of the dialogue from both Kratos and Freya feels like it's supposed to be much more highbrow than it ends up being. Like, pretty much their entire conversation leading up to Nidhogg feels really pedantic and philosophic at the same time. And maybe it's because all of Atreus' dialogue was reworked because the actor's voice changed, but wow, Atreus' reasoning and dialogue is awful. Look, I get that Atreus is trying to fool Odin and doesn't actually trust him. And I get that Kratos and the others know that, but I still think that Odin would see through Atreus. And I also get that Atreus is supposed to be acting like a dumb teenager right now, but wow, was that handled poorly. First of all, they kind of fumble the fact that Atreus doesn't trust the Aesir at all. If you're not paying attention, you'll think that Atreus wants to just meet Odin and see what he can learn about Ragnarok, and that implies that there's some kind of trust established, which there shouldn't be. He only clarifies one time that he specifically doesn't trust the Aesir, with us left to wonder the rest of the time why he's even there. He says he's there to learn more about prophecy and Loki, neither of which Odin should know anything about. Odin didn't know Groa's prophecy, and he shouldn't have known who Loki is. Which, by the way, this may seem like a ton of nitpicking, but there's a ton of reasons why the Odin Tyr reveal just doesn't work. The biggest one for me is that he's Odin for majority of time Atreus is away, and Tyr when Atreus is around. Even if this was somehow possible for the King of Asgard to just disappear a bunch, I guarantee you Kratos would suss this out immediately. Even if we want to give credit to Brock for figuring this out, it should have been from the timing of Tyr and Atreus' presence. This is your reminder to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Also, what's wrong with this reveal is one of the biggest side missions of this and the last game is Odin's Ravens, and you probably know where I'm going with this. In the 2018 game, Odin's Ravens were this really cool piece of lore that was essentially a collectible. It basically said that Odin was in fact watching our entire journey, even if not constantly. Now the Ravens make a return in this game, except now it's added to the lore that they're dead children's souls forced to do Odin's bidding, and that we're freeing them by killing them outside Niflheim. Now, while that is pretty cool and creative, and they give you significantly better rewards in a boss fight, it then doesn't matter in the slightest that Odin's hanging around as Tyr. I don't know if you've noticed, but our characters are constantly talking about the goal as they travel. So why would the Tyr stuff matter if Odin's Ravens are watching them anyway? I know it's just a side quest, but I don't think it'd be that hard to make it make sense. Now we get to talk about the mask. Wow, this mask is really one of the most McGuffins I've ever seen. I think it's just an excuse for Odin and Atreus to work together, and it feels like no care was put into craft a better reason. I really like the idea of some kind of realm that even our gods don't understand, but the game doesn't put any effort into the mask at all. Like, the writing on it isn't supposed to be of the 9 realms, but also the other pieces are hidden in the 9 realms. I don't know, maybe there's something I'm missing on that. But I do know that if the mask didn't exist, then Odin wouldn't really have any reason to keep Atreus around or pose as Tyr. Now for some of the characters that people have problems with, which I'll agree or disagree with. I know no one likes the new shopkeeper Lunda, and I completely agree. I don't know why there are southerners in the 9 realms. I don't know why they didn't give her more than like 5 shopkeeper lines. I know some people didn't like Freyr. I actually liked him, but I thought it was annoying that most of his characterization was given in Alfheim stories. It makes sense, but it's leading into the biggest problem I have with this game, which I'll get to really soon. I know some people hated Freya's heel turn. I actually thought it was one of the best parts of the whole game. And I think people misunderstand what it actually means. Freya is upset at Kratos because he refused to listen to her in the last game and killed Baldur, her son. This was actually a selfish, kinda manipulative move from Freya, because we have to remember that Baldur asked her to remove the spell and she said she didn't know how to do it. But she also knows that Mistletoe would do it, so in her trying to let Baldur kill her, it was kinda the easy way out. But then Kratos gets Baldur first. So Freya is more so mad about Kratos interfering at all rather than Baldur's actual death. Notice that she doesn't bother reanimating him like with Mimir. I know they make an excuse about that, but still. So now Freya is trying to kill Kratos, and Freya doesn't forgive Kratos immediately. They kill Nidhogg, which is the best boss in the game by the way, and then she allies herself with Kratos to kill Odin. They have resolved their conflict, but Kratos isn't really forgiven until the end of the game when Odin finally goes down. So I like Freya's personal journey. Atreus is also a bit weird. I'll never say that Atreus was a bad character or anything, but after all the weird Asgard and mask stuff, he's already on probation. It doesn't help that I really am not a fan of his performance in-game. I saw in an interview that Sonny Suljic, Atreus' actor, feels that his performance in this game is a lot better than his performance in the last, which just isn't really true. I think that young Atreus has the benefit of being played by a child that is trying to impress the audience, so it comes off as him trying to impress Kratos and feels extremely natural. Whereas in this game, and again maybe it's just because of all the redone voice stuff, Atreus just sounds like he's acting. I hear way more Sonny than anything, which is definitely not a positive. After that, to be honest, the character I was most disappointed in was Jormungandr. The game has a weird habit of technically continuing threads from the last game in like the weirdest ways possible. Like everything with Jormi felt extremely strange and like almost an afterthought. But like I said before, the absolute number one biggest problem with this game is just how rushed everything feels, but also like we're not doing anything. Like I heard in interviews that it was risky to condense everything down to 2 games rather than a trilogy, but also that's just not really true. Like, think about it. You'd imagine that after the last game, Jormi's journey through time would be like a whole mission. Freyr's kidnapping would be an entire plot. Surtur should have been like a chunk of the game rather than a piece. For so much condensing of the story, it still feels extremely watered down. So yes, technically it was risky to turn a 3-game series into a 2-game series. But the easiest way to fix that is to make the second game longer, even if it requires a bit more time and money. I don't think anyone would have minded an extra 5 to 10 hours in the story so long as it was engaging and offered more gameplay components. The story's length wasn't the problem, it was the fact that it didn't match up with the game's length. And when I say that it feels watered down, I am referencing the 22-hour slog in Jotunheim with Atreus and Angerboda. I get that they thought it was really important, but I also wholeheartedly disagree. As for the open world, I find it slightly disappointing. I actually really like Niflheim and Svartalfheim. I think they're both done very well. I wish Vanaheim wasn't quite as annoying to traverse, especially when you're looking for those last few ravens you missed, but it's still quite beautiful, and I quite enjoyed the crater and all of its contents. Muspelheim was significantly better in the 2018 game. While the realm looked a little bit samey, the traversal was a big part of why completing challenges felt so satisfying, and to get a cool Valkyrie at the end was incredibly rewarding. In this game, you basically have interconnected arenas, and the challenges are really boring and repetitive and make you just play a bit differently rather than giving you different mechanics to use. And instead of finding a Valkyrie at the peak of all the challenges you've completed and the arenas you've unlocked, it's just like off to the side of where you've spent a bunch of time already. The other realms I take issue with are Helheim and Jotunheim. Jotunheim is more excusable because it doesn't really make sense for Kratos to spend a bunch of time there anyway, but you can still visit. I do kinda wish Helheim had more though, like you can 100% that realm during the story. Alfheim is okay, I like the amount of content in the Halfgufas, but I wish there was a bit more content in the temple itself, as I found that to be the more beautiful part of the realm that we only spend about an hour exploring. And then Midgard is probably the most disappointing. I know that in the last game, Midgard felt extremely expansive. It truly lived up to the exploration title in terms of loot, side missions, secret areas, and overall just hours upon hours of content. Because this game has all the realms in some capacity, none of them feel nearly as expansive as Midgard in the last game. Even Midgard itself. Vanaheim comes the closest to this, but it still feels like a bunch of different paths rather than it does a sandbox. This is why I think the first game comes a lot closer to the open world title than this game. The last thing I want to talk about is the actual weaponry we use. I like both of Atreus' bow types for puzzles and combat, although I do wish that sigil arrows upped the base damage a bit so that they feel more different than the sonic arrows stun. but in terms of creativity, they're both fantastic. All of Atreus' combat is good in a vacuum, but it's incredibly dull compared to Kratos', and then Freya as a companion is honestly better in a lot of ways. But Kratos himself is a bit harder to classify. The spear, axe, and blades are amazing. I'm personally glad we didn't get the hammer. I think it would have been cheap and kind of played too similarly to the axe. Weirdly enough, I think they were really struggling to come up with the runic attacks, especially for the blades. Some of them are like the same move, and then some are just a bit silly. And also, I never thought I'd say this, but the look of weapons in this game is significantly worse. Armor looks actually pretty good, but weapons look kinda dull. Again, specifically the blades and the spear when you upgrade it. And I don't know why they did this, but the weapons don't look as powerful and they look a lot more tactical. Again, more for the blades than anything. Like, in the first game, they looked like blades that would keep you warm in a realm where no fire burns. The fire on the blades looked really cool, and in this game, they only look cool when you have, like, immolation or some other effect. Normal attacks just look dull. A bit more visceral, but dull. I could say that for a lot of things in this game, like the HUD and even the camera shake you'll barely notice, whereas in the first game it added a clear effect to the story. One clear compliment I can give is the music. This game has some of the most dynamic and beautiful themes and tracks I've ever seen in a video game. I think the first game caught lightning in a bottle with some of its themes, like the Dragon and Jotunheim, but this game has more consistent bangers, like the Alfheim theme, the Helheim theme, which is surprisingly fantastic for a bit of a retread, the Hidden Beast, my personal favorite, Gryla's theme, which is the most fresh and still good one, the Hammer of Thor, and the Hand of Odin. I don't know why, but I don't really like A Sun's Path. I know everyone else goes crazy for it, but I'm not huge on it. Garm's theme isn't in the soundtrack, but it's still a really cool, more hostile version of the Dragon in 2018, and then obviously the Allfather is really good too. This game is the biggest example of some of the weirdest trends in Sony game sequels as a side note. I've noticed that Sony sequels usually have a base of operations when the first game was more nomadic, like the base in Horizon, the theater in The Last of Us Part 2, and Miles' apartment in May's house in Spider-Man 2, or the more tactical look for HUD and weapons, again like the games I just named, with the exception of SM2. Ragnarök has both Sindri's house and the more tactical look, so yeah, I guess that's something to note. Anyway, to stop rambling so much, this game gets an 8 out of 10. It loses 2 points from last time. I gave it a 10 because of recency bias and because I wanted to love it because the 2018 game is my favorite of all time. But this game has a lot of other problems that I tried too hard to ignore. For example, one of the cooler parts of the last game was how it barely even felt like a game and had very few video gamey elements that were non-diegetic. Like when Mimir shouts in panic as you're about to be attacked from the flank. Yes, that's essentially a danger indicator, but it also makes sense in the story. In this game, every single aspect of combat feels super removed from the story, which I personally think is a huge downgrade. Although credit where credit's due, I still think the bosses are one of the best parts of this game and a huge improvement from the last. That part hasn't changed. But that's just my thoughts on it. If you enjoyed, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribed to the channel to see more of my content. Or not, that's fine. Play nice, people.